Welcome again to Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and today, without really realizing it until I started getting ready for the show, today is kind of a continuation of what we were talking about last week. To refresh the memories of those that perhaps joined us, and for those who weren't able to make it, here's a brief synopsis of what the show was about. We talked about what kind of nation we have. Now that can be the collective that we might have here geographically. The idea of a nation can take on different aspects. I gave the example of the Woodstock nation that existed in the 60s, late 60s. And at the end of that program, I made the suggestion, or perhaps more of a hope, I guess would be the better way of describing it, that I would hope that we would have a nation of activists. And under activists, I also gave the example that passive resistance is a form of activism. And that would be my wish. So I started on this journey of getting ready for today's program. And I will talk about three individuals, one state that we've had since 1619, and where that leads us. And I will see within 57 minutes how much that will lead to me. First off, I'd like to go ahead and start with a description of Hannah Arendt, who was a political philosopher, died when she was 69, had a doctorate in philosophy, but she saw herself as being a political theorist. And she was neither a leftist or from the right, and that made her both popular and reviled. But some of the thoughts that Arendt talked about purely dovetail into this idea of nation and identity. So, of course, when we talk about we are referring to some sort of collective identity, because then you always have to go ahead and pose a question. So, who is we? Who belongs to that group of we? Because after all, we are often very selective when we're talking about we. And we don't always go through the trouble of explaining our definition. And of course, this question of identity is a moving target because it never stays the same. We never stay the same, regardless of whether we recognize that or not. I would even go ahead and argue that under this we will have different definitions because, after all, we all have different perspectives, or should have different perspectives. And so, therefore, this idea of we is constantly in a state of flux. And from that, you can actually go ahead and say that we is a work in progress. Part of Arendt's philosophy was based upon this concept called the vita activa, or the active life. And she broke this concept into a couple different categories, 3 categories, but the 2 I'd like to just go ahead and briefly describe, and we'll have more of the focus on the 3rd. She makes a differentiation between what she calls labor, which are basically the activities that we need to perform in order to survive. And then there is work, which, according to her definition, is our purpose. And that work phase or state, whatever way we want to go ahead and define that, is a condition for political agency or having a basis to be politically active. And I believe that Arendt considered very similar to what Maslow talked about in his hierarchy of needs, that you need to be able to fulfill the needs of one level of that pyramid before you can actually go ahead and move on to the other. I don't think it's necessarily clearly stated, but I personally see a correlation between the two. So what does this all have to do with the 1619 Project? First, let me go ahead and explain to all of you what the 1619 Project is all about. Perhaps maybe some of you might have heard of it. I suspect a number of you haven't. The project that was initiated by the New York Times was to commemorate, let's try this properly, commemorate 400 years of when the slaves arrived in North America. And of course, we know about the discussions that were taking place last year tied to Black Lives Matter, and much of the impetus that we saw through Black Lives Matter can be directly deduced from some of the thoughts that were expressed within this project, the 1619 Project. The Times brought together a group of thinkers who were to look at the situation, not only 1619, but the 400 years that commenced up till today. And the intention was to look, understand, and analyze the narrative. And in the United States right now, there are a number of hot discussions tied to this concept called the critical theory, which is directly related to this idea of questioning the narrative that we have based the country on for so many years. And because, of course, the ideal that people felt was part of that concept of nation was being blown up in front of their eyes. And this is much worse than cognitive dissonance, because that means that for certain individuals, they raise the question, well, if this is not true, then what is true? And we end up having a nation of nihilists. And we can see a direct relationship between the election of Trump, the actions that took place on the 6th of January, and what is actually being defended. So what's the correlation between the vita activa, the political agency in 1619. Part of the issue that we have is that we have this tendency to romanticize the past as if those individuals that we're describing within the history books, that they were perfect. And we don't really believe that they were perfect, but we have this idea that they were much greater than us. They always had an overview of the situation, what they were doing, and the results that they were actually looking for. And we tend to forget that we're talking about human beings that have the frailty just like you and me. So if we're talking about perfection, and it doesn't matter who those founding individuals may be, here's a factoid for you, something that I didn't realize, that 12 of the first 15 U.S. presidents were slave owners. Now, when you think about it, we think about these presidents and at least I do, I tend to think that, well, that was their profession, that was their career. But that's not the case, especially going back over 200 years ago. The idea of being president was a culmination of a number of activities that an individual would go ahead and perform. So if 12 of the first 15 presidents of the United States were slave owners, I'm going to make an assumption that the slaves were used for commerce. In other words, the slaves were there to go ahead and generate the revenue that allowed them to be worthy, quote unquote, of entering the office of the presidency. So actually, the situation that we are talking about is much worse than I think any of us could have realized. The idea of 1619, and I'd like to think the idea of Black Lives Matter, is to set the record straight, meaning that we need to get past this romantic narrative that was never true to begin with before we can actually go ahead and make progress, because this story is the blocker. It's holding us back from actually coming to some sort of reconciliation, because how are we supposed to achieve reconciliation if we keep avoiding the truth? And to close this circle, the real narrative that has continued since the end of the Civil War in the United States was this concept called the lost cause. And the lost cause was a narrative coming out of the South that romanticized the rationale of the war, the victimhood that they were all under due to the fact that the war was lost. And the lost cause was represented through various symbols to be found within the South, apart from the fact of Jim Crow, which is clearly part of that. But the idea of having their own flag, and we have to remember it was only recently that there was talk about removing the Confederate flag from a number of the state capitals in the South. certainly only within the last 10 years, I would say. And we know what took place in Charlottesville in 2017 when there was talk of removing the statue of Robert E. Lee, who was the general who lost the Civil War for the South, and the reaction that actually came from it. So within this concept of a nation, not only are we talking about a collective identity, but one can argue what is an implicit when we talk about an identity that would mean that we would have a collective conscience, a way that we look at things, and in fact, once we start questioning the narrative, then there's a real danger that the rest falls apart. And there are a number of examples, not just in the United States, of where this actually applies. So the question I pose to you, what is our collective narrative? And to what degree is it based on truth? You are listening to Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and our show today is titled, Are We or Aren't We? Stories of Authority, Obedience, and Renewal. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this program, without planning it, this is somewhat of a continuum of that of what we discussed last week, and that was the idea of a nationhood, what a nation is, defining what kind of nation do we have. Is there one definition? So, moving past 1619 and fast forwarding to 1961. And we haven't forgotten Hannah Arendt. She was a witness at the trial that took place in Jerusalem in 1961 of Adolf Eichmann. And she got a lot of flack for her reporting because it has everything to do with this collective narrative that we feel that we need for our identity, and often does not wholly depict the truth. Her observation of Eichmann was very interesting. She coined the phrase, the banality of evil, and her argumentation was that Eichmann was actually pretty boring. He wasn't the most intelligent creature on the planet. And there is no way that this gentleman could be the mastermind. And of course, for those of you who are not familiar with the story of Adolf Eichmann, he was known to be the architect, or to be the main operator, let's put it that way, of the final solution. After the war in 1945, he escaped to Argentina. Part of Eichmann's problems is that he talked first and thought afterwards, or didn't think afterwards at all. He just talked. And he was getting bored of his existence in Argentina and was telling a lot of stories about his glorious past. And with that, he was easy enough to find. So the Israelis found him. They kidnapped him from Argentina and brought him to Israel. And his trial took place in 1961, and eventually he was executed. Now, when we talk about a collective narrative, we know this story quite well here in Europe. The idea of guilt, what's required for redemption, and this propensity that we have of always saying, apart from the fact that we keep repeating the phrase never again, that couldn't happen today, that those in the past, are not like us, because we know better, and we simply won't let those things happen. And it's very interesting when we look at what was taking place directly following the Second World War. People had no time for reflection. They were in survival mode, and it was much easier to leave all of that behind, at least for the short term. And there was a historian by the name of Tony Judd who talks about this in a book titled Post-War, and he goes into detail, very long book, and he talks about a number of these things, especially what was the zeitgeist to be found in Europe, specifically in the 50s, up to the 60s. And according to Judd, Eichmann's trial was a watershed because it was the first time also for the Israelis to address that of what took place between, well, certainly in the case of the Jews, starting at 33 to 45. We could even go farther back, but let's not. And of course, in each country, this narrative was played out a little bit different. The interesting part, of course, is looking at it from the side of West Germany, where actually in 1967 there was a chancellor by the name of Kurt Kiesinger, who was known to have been a member of the Nazi Party in 1933. Just to show how far we were in actually performing that reflection and understanding what is right. And perhaps this might be a local rendition of the lost cause narrative. Who knows? But this really culminated. It took a few years But we see all of the movements that took place here in Europe in 1968, or a number of the movements that took place in 1968, were directly tied to this question, so what did you do during the war? And certainly one of the highlights goes back to the action that took place from an individual who's still around, Beate Glasfeld, who went up and slapped the face of Kurt Kiesinger and called him what he was, a former Nazi. So we see that Hannah Arendt was being chastised by the Jewish community because she was making the claim that this idea of evil in what they were doing during the trial, that they were blaming a bureaucrat for the actions that took place. And in essence, one can make the argument about who holds the guilt and how we are able to derive absolution based upon the actions that perhaps have nothing to do with reality, or certainly what the reality was at that time. You are listening to Radio Tipping Point, and our show today is titled Are We or Aren't We? Stories of Authority, Obedience, and Renewal. And for those of you who perhaps listened last week, and the question of nationhood, we've gone past the collective identity. We've gone past the idea of collective narrative. And now we have entered the realm of collective guilt. So let's go past Eichmann and the guilt and the absolution of saying it wasn't us, it was him, or it was them. And that's what will make us free. There was a psychologist by the name of Stanley Milgram who knew enough about that situation as his parents came from Romania and Hungary to enter the United States. And Milgram was very much afflicted by that condition. That was not really talked about. Only starting in the 60s was the subject actually looked at, and it was the beginning of coming up with new narratives and let's not even talk about reconciliation. Well, in any case, Milgram was enthralled with the Eichmann trial and wanted to better understand this question when we go ahead and pose the phrase never again. wanted to know for himself, is that true? Can we actually make that claim, never again? So Milgram performed an experiment in 1963 where he gathered up 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50, and this took place in the United States, in New Haven, Connecticut. And the individuals who participated, first of all, they came from all walks of life. In other words, they were not a homogeneous group, but rather, as far as you can consider white males to be heterogeneous, but for that time that was probably the best we were going to do. It was a relatively heterogeneous group. So you would have day laborers and professionals, quote unquote, all part of that group. And they were given $4.50 for actually showing up. So Milgram wanted to find out to what degree, if the situation is created where the individuals had to make some sort of value judgment, how would they react? So what Milgram did was he created two groups. One were teachers, the other ones were learners. And they were divvied up. In other words, certain individuals would be teachers and the others would be learners. But little did the learners know that the selection of the teachers had already been staged. Sorry, my correction, the situation of actually teachers and learners were staged. But the learners were actually actors. So that means that the individuals who were to be tested took on the role of teachers. And so the learners would be strapped into a leather chair, and then subsequently the electrodes would be placed onto the learners. And again, just to make sure it's clear, the learners are stooges. In other words, they are in on the act. They are acting. They're actually actors. They're not learners, they're actors. But within this exercise, they were asked to come up with paired words that they were to study. And they would be tested on the accuracy of what they studied. And so the teacher would go ahead and ask the learner a question, and if the learner was to come up with the wrong answer, the teacher was asked to go ahead and submit an electric shock to the learner. Now the scope of the voltage, which of course was all fake, was between 15 and 450 volts. And 15 volts would be a light shock, but 450 volts is lethal. And so the real question that Milgram was trying to answer is whether those teachers, if given an order that was clearly not ethical, would they follow it? And the learners were actors, as mentioned, and dependent upon the voltage that was executed from the teacher, they were to play act as if they were actually getting that voltage. So again, the question was whether the teachers, in this case, whether they would follow orders. And is very often the case, Some were able to follow those orders without much thought whatsoever. And others were hesitant because they saw how the learners were reacting. So that's when Milgram went into phase 2 of this experiment. And he would have certain prods administered to the teachers. And let me give you some examples of some of the prods that came through. The first one was, please continue. The second one was, the experiment requires you to continue. Prod number 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And 4 is quite clear. You have no other choice but to continue. And here are the results. 65%, that means 2/3 of the participants, i.e. the teachers, they continued to the highest level of 450 volts. And all of the participants continued to at least 300 volts. So was that part of our collective narrative? Okay, we'll go ahead and continue next week, as this story is clearly not finished. And some food for thought for all of you. Making the differentiation between the situational, how we react due to the situation, and the dispositional, that we're born this way. How do these two states play a role into those things that we talked about today? And of course, this idea of nation. Thanks a lot for listening.